Imagine discovering in the midst of the harshest winter that the difference between comfort and death is not strength, it's about survival. While an entire community repeated ancient traditions, a single woman did something that seemed wrong. Nobody noticed at first. No one questioned it, until the real cold weather arrives. Because when the wind closes roads, the firewood rots, the fire fails. Survival is no longer a distant concept, and it becomes a silent decision, made before the mistake happens. Stay until the end, because this story isn't about the cold, it's about who was prepared, and those who only realized it too late. In the harshest winter the valley had ever remembered, in a cold region of the American interior, the houses followed the same pattern for generations. Firewood stacked away from the walls, paths leading to small sheds, everything separated, as it had always been done. Not Eleanor's house. Surrounding the simple building was a strange shed, too wide, too quiet. A roof that seemed excessive. A miscalculation, they said. Some laughed as they passed. Others looked away, certain that it wouldn't last until the first serious cold snap. She didn't explain. She continued piling firewood there, so close to the door that it only took one step. When the cold arrived earlier than expected, when the wind closed roads and the dampness began to rot other people's firewood, no one knocked on Eleanor's door yet. But by then, the difference had already been made. And that wasn't even the worst of winter. The community was small and old. Low houses made of aged wood, built using the same method repeated for decades. There, surviving the winter was nothing new. It was routine, but routine didn't mean comfort, only resilience. Everyone knew how it worked. Chop wood before the first cold fronts, stack it away from the house to prevent fires, cover it with tarps, and hope that the winter wouldn't be too wet. It worked, until it stopped working. She arrived later, no important last name, no husband by her side, no stories to tell at the city market. He built his house with what he had, simple, functional, and then he did something that nobody understood. He erected a shed around the house as if he were protecting not the walls, but the space between them. The roof protruded too far. The columns seemed excessive. The firewood was too close. "It's going to catch fire," someone commented. "It's all going to rot," said another. "When the cold really sets in, she'll learn," a third person concluded. Eleanor was listening. She continued working. While the others chopped firewood together, laughing and betting on who would ask for help first, she worked alone, measuring, adjusting, stacking the firewood high up, away from the damp ground, protected from the side rain. There was no rush in the gestures, not even an explanation in their eyes. The cold hadn't truly arrived yet, but the air already carried that unsettling promise. This winter wouldn't be easy. The shed didn't appear all at once. It grew gradually, as if she were testing the limits of what the place would accept. First, the roof protruded, a few centimeters more than necessary. Then the columns were set too close to the house. Next, the firewood started piling up there, not at the back of the property, not far from the building, but almost touching the walls. That broke an old rule. Keeping firewood away from the house was a sign of prudence. Having firewood nearby was careless. The neighbors didn't need to ask why. They had already decided it was a mistake. Eleanor knew the risk. Any spark could be fatal. But she also knew another danger, more common and less talked about. Leaving home in the extreme cold, at night, with a biting wind, to fetch damp firewood that barely burned. The shed solved that problem. It protected the firewood from the constant rain. It prevented soil moisture from rising. And most importantly, it eliminated the need to brave the cold to keep the fire burning. It was a silent choice between two risks. She chose what she could control. While the others piled firewood directly on the ground covered by torn tarpaulins, she lifted each piece. She created air spaces between the logs, not for aesthetics, but for drying. The shed didn't completely close off the sides. The wind circulated, carrying the moisture away. "You're wasting your time," they said. "This winter will punish those who try to be trendy." They laughed. She didn't answer. Work progressed slowly. Each day spent adjusting the shed was a day less for chopping wood. Those observing from the outside miscalculated. They saw little volume piled up and assumed premature failure. What they didn't see was the quality. Her firewood was light, dry. It cleaned the blade as it chopped. The others were starting to darken, swollen from the dampness that didn't seem like a problem yet. But it would be. The cold arrived first at night. Then, he stayed during the day. When the first cold front brought heavy frost, some neighbors were already complaining about the smoke. Damp firewood burned poorly, consumed quickly, and required more trips to the shed. Eleanor continued to tend the fire without leaving the house, without opening any windows, without letting the heat escape. The shed, now complete, looked even stranger with the cold air vapor swirling around its structure. The house seemed dressed for winter, while the others remained exposed. Still, no one asked for explanations. Winter had barely begun, and when people still believe they have time, they rarely admit that someone else made a better choice. The first week of continuous cold weather did not bring despair. It caused discomfort. The mornings began with the same routine: doors hard to open, hands burning from touching metal, thick smoke billowing from the chimneys before the sun rose. It was like this every year. Nothing new, but something started to change. The neighbors' firewood no longer dried during the day. The nighttime humidity, combined with cold days and a lack of strong sun, meant that each log required 2, sometimes 3, attempts to catch fire. The heat was weak. Consumption increased. Eleanor first noticed it because of the silence. While the other houses crackled, coughed up smoke, and gave off the smell of burnt wood, hers maintained a steady fire. Not louder, just constant. The shed was doing exactly what she had predicted. The firewood didn't touch the ground. The rain didn't reach us. The wind was drying things out. On the third consecutive night with temperatures below zero, a neighbor passed by the fence and cast a long glance. She said nothing. She merely mentally counted how many piles of firewood she still had. Inside the house, Eleanor adjusted the fire slowly. There was no need to overdo it. Just maintain it. The heat remained trapped within the walls, without sudden fluctuations. 2 days later, the first consequence appeared. One of the men from the community had to cross the yard in the early morning to fetch more firewood. The pile was partially covered in melted snow. He slipped. He wasn't seriously hurt, but he returned limping, cursing the cold, the ground, and his own planning. Eleanor heard the story the next day. He didn't comment. The warehouse also began to show another advantage: savings. Her firewood yielded more. Each piece delivered real heat, not smoke. Consumption was lower. The stock, visually smaller, did not diminish at the same rate as the others. Still, no one mentioned any fault on their part. It was too early to admit it. The weather gradually worsened. Longer winds, persistent humidity. The afternoons began to get darker earlier. In the second week, a minor incident went almost unnoticed. During the early morning hours, the wind shifted direction, pushing freezing rain under poorly secured tarpaulins. Some piles of wood became soaked. By morning, there was already talk of lost firewood. Eleanor only went as far as the edge of the shed. The firewood was intact. The extended roof diverted the water. The open sides prevented buildup. It was the first time someone had asked a direct question. "Is there any dry firewood left there?" She nodded. Nothing more. He offered no help, not out of pride, but because it was still early. The first test was not the winter itself. It was about resisting without drawing attention. Because those who draw attention to themselves too early become targets when things really get worse. That night, the temperature dropped more than expected. It wasn't a storm, just a dense, stagnant cold that seeps in slowly. She slept with the fire burning steadily. The others woke up to feed him several times, and without realizing it, they began counting the days not until the end of winter, but until the first real failure. The mistake didn't come from outside. It came from exhaustion. After weeks of continuous cold, the body begins to fail before the mind even admits it. Gestures become automatic. Attention drops. Small decisions are made without review. That afternoon, the wind changed again. No longer constant, irregular. Short, strong gusts, pushing the cold into the cracks. Eleanor adjusted the fire as usual. She added 2 dry logs, closed the shed door, and went back inside. It was enough. It always had been. But that night, the cold arrived faster than expected. The kind of fall that gives no warning. The kind that steals heat even with the fire lit. She realized it too late. The house didn't cool down all at once. It was a slow decline. The heat was no longer sustained between meals. The fire burned, but less than necessary. One of the logs she had placed there, which was too dry, burned quickly, faster than she had anticipated. In the middle of the night, he woke up to the wrong silence. Not the silence of the night, the silence of the dying fire. He stood up immediately. The shed was there, accessible as always. The firewood was dry. Nothing had failed in the structure. The mistake had been human. She fed the fire again, this time more carefully, choosing denser pieces that would burn slowly. She adjusted the air intake. She waited, but the cold had already set in too much. That's when he heard the sound. A short, weak cough, coming from the darkest corner of the house. Caleb, the child, was too hot, and trembling at the same time. A wrong sign, a dangerous sign. Eleanor sat down beside him, put her hand to her forehead and felt the uneven warmth. There was no doctor nearby. No neighbors were awake, and leaving the house at that hour meant losing what little warmth she had regained. The decision was made quietly. She kept the fire burning, even knowing it would use more firewood. She didn't think about the stockpile. She only thought about maintaining a stable temperature. She fetched the firewood from the shed without leaving Caleb's sight. No exposure to the wind, no rushing. Outside, the cold was biting. In another house, not far away, someone tried to do the same. They had to go out to get firewood from the shed. They returned disoriented, took longer than they should have, and left the door open for too long. The result spread the following morning in short phrases, spoken softly. He almost didn't come back. They found him lying near the door. The fire went out. Eleanor did not comment. She spent the rest of the night sitting, feeding the fire at short intervals, watching the child's breathing, waiting for the body to decide if it would resist. The shed was no longer just a practical choice. It was the difference between staying and leaving. When day broke, the worst was over. Not resolved, just contained. The fever hadn't risen any higher. The fire had not failed again. She stepped out to the edge of the shed for the first time that morning. The wind had pushed snow against the exposed houses. Some sheds were partially buried, not hers. The mistake had been minor, the consequences almost irreversible. And at that point in winter, everyone began to understand that it wouldn't be the last time someone made a mistake. The difference would be where each person would need to be when that happened. The cold has stopped fluctuating. It's settled in. There were no more good days waiting for the other side of the week. Winter had taken complete control of the valley, and everything began to function on a regime of attrition. The body, the firewood, patience. The nights became too long. The days are too short to correct mistakes. The wind began to sweep across the terrain without a fixed pattern, creating whirlwinds that buried familiar paths. Some traditional huts disappeared under snow piled against their bare walls. Others remained visible but inaccessible. Eleanor watched everything from the doorway without going out. The shed surrounding the house did something no one had fully anticipated. It prevented the uneven accumulation of snow. The extended roof broke the wind. The snow fell and ran off. It didn't pile up against the walls. It didn't block the passage. The firewood was still there, dry, in the same place. In the third week of continuous cold weather, the problem ceased to be one of comfort. It became a matter of survival. One of the families in the valley began rationing the fire at night. The decision seemed logical, to save firewood to last for several more weeks. But the body doesn't respond well to sudden drops in temperature. The heat lost during the night is not easily recovered. A child became ill, then another one. Eleanor knew when she heard footsteps outside the shed. Cautious footsteps, hesitant. A man standing there didn't immediately ask for help. He observed the structure. He measured the distance between the house's door and the pile of firewood. He noticed how the ground remained clean, without any accumulated ice. "Do you still have dry firewood?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He didn't explain the problem. He didn't need to. People only ask this question when the fire has already failed at least once. Eleanor delivered some logs. Not many, just enough to get us through the night. There was no conversation, not even excessive gratitude. That same night, the worst cold front of the winter began to form. The sky darkened too early. The wind lost direction. A heavy silence preceded the impact. When it arrived, it came as a single block. The cold advanced quickly, driven by gusts that cut off your breath. The snow fell fine and steady, covering everything without a sound. It wasn't a violent storm. It was worse. He was persistent. Inside the house, Eleanor kept the fire burning, not at maximum, steady. She knew now that stability was everything. Caleb was still weak. He didn't get worse. He didn't get better. He required constant attention. Outside, someone tried to reach the woodshed in the dark. They lost all sense of distance. They returned too late, clearly showing signs of exposure to the cold. She found out in the morning, when more footsteps appeared at the edge of the shed. This time, there were no questions. "Can we stay here until the fire is under control?" they asked. She made room. He didn't comment. People entered the shed and stopped in silence, observing the simplicity of the solution. Nothing sophisticated, nothing heroic, just proximity, protection, and logic. The cold weather continued for days. During that period, her house didn't become a collective shelter. That wasn't its purpose, but it became a point of reference, a fixed location, a place where the fire wouldn't go out due to error, exhaustion, or distance. The shack held up. The firewood continued to burn cleanly. The heat remained constant. When the cold front finally began to subside, the valley looked different. Less smoke rising from the chimneys, fewer steps at dawn, fewer voices, and pay more attention. People didn't laugh anymore. They didn't praise them either. They were just watching, because now they knew that the worst of winter could still return. And when he returned, there would only be one important question: who could keep the fire burning without leaving home? The request was not made aloud. It came in the form of presence. First, someone stood too close to the shed. Then, another. They didn't go in. They didn't ask questions. They just observed the covered space, the clean floor, the firewood piled where the wind didn't reach. It was the same place that used to generate laughter. Now it generated silence. Winter wasn't over, but it had already left enough marks to change behaviors. Some houses were cold inside even with fires burning. Others burned too much firewood and knew that this would take its toll later. Eleanor continued as before, no stronger, no longer confident, functional only. On a gray afternoon when the cold was biting even without snow, one of the neighbors who had laughed at the beginning crossed the property slowly. He stopped at the edge of the shed. He took off his hat. He stood there for a few seconds before speaking. "Our firewood is damp." Nothing more than that. She didn't answer immediately. She picked up 2 logs, dry ones. She placed them closer to the edge. The gesture ended the conversation before it even began. The man nodded. He carried the firewood as if carrying something fragile. After him, others came. No one was asking to copy the shack. Not yet. They were asking for time. They were asking to borrow warmth. They were asking for a night without risk. She helped when she could. No speeches. No moral reckoning. A few days later, one of the oldest men in the valley stopped there. The same one who had said that this wouldn't last until the harsh winter. He looked at the extended roof, at the neatly arranged piles, at how close the door was. "If I wanted to do the same," she began, then stopped mid-sentence. She waited. "How did you calculate that?" Eleanor didn't mention calculations. He pointed to the ground, then onto the roof, then to the door. That was all. The man understood. That week, marks began to appear on the land around other houses, posts being driven into the ground, roofs extending a few feet beyond their usual height, firewood being lifted off the ground. Nothing like hers, but clearly inspired. She observed from afar. She didn't correct. She didn't offer plans. She knew that each person needed to adapt to their own home, to their own fear. Respect wasn't expressed in words. It came as an imitation. The shack ceased to be her mistake and became the only possible solution. When the cold set in at night, no one laughed at the shape of the house anymore. Some even looked away, as if recognizing that they had judged it too soon. Eleanor wasn't seeking validation, but it existed, and that winter, that was enough. When winter began to ease, there was no celebration, just continuity. The cold receded in stages, as if testing who had learned something and who had merely endured by luck. Some mornings dawned less harsh. Others still demanded constant fire, but the worst was over. The houses that had to put out the fire at night have not forgotten. Those who lost firewood to the damp have not forgotten, and those who almost lost someone, even less so. Around her house, the shed remained exactly as it had been on the first day. No extensions, no visible repairs. Not because it was perfect, but because it had served its purpose when it mattered most. In the spring, when the ground began to give way under the thaw, some people approached not to ask for immediate help, but to observe more closely. They measured distances. They touched the dry wood that still remained. They looked at the sprawling roof with less prejudice. They no longer asked why. They asked how. She explained little. She showed more. She pointed out the importance of keeping the firewood off the ground, of not closing the sides too tightly, of allowing the wind to work in your favor. Some copied it almost exactly, others adapted to what they had. The following winter, fewer houses suffered, not by miracle, by repetition, by silent learning. The shed ceased to be a topic of conversation. It became part of the landscape, as if it had always been there. No one remembered exactly when it started. They only knew that it worked. Eleanor continued living there, without prominence, without an informal leadership position. She remained the same discreet presence, but something had changed. When new families arrived, someone would point to her house and simply say, "That one over there got through the last winter just fine." That was enough. The legacy was not a specific building. It was logical. Proximity instead of overexertion, protection instead of exposure, structure rather than brute strength, and it spread. Not in books, not in speeches, but in slightly different houses. The shed around the house was never an attempt to teach anyone. It was merely a silent response to an old problem. While some relied on custom, she relied on observation. While they laughed at the form, she thought about the function. When the cold truly arrived, there were no speeches, no apologies, just the realization that certain solutions don't need to seem right. They need to work. Winter has passed. Her firewood remained dry, and after that nobody laughed again. Because in places where the cold decides who stays, the truth doesn't prevail through voice. It stays lit. Before you leave this video, think about this. No one in that valley survived because they were stronger. Not even because there was more firewood. Not even to follow tradition. Those who survived were the ones who thought differently before the mistake happened. This story is not about winter. It's about silent decisions that nobody applauds, until the day when everything gets tough. If you've stayed this far, it's because you understand that survival isn't about shouting. She's getting ready. She observes. It works. If this type of story makes sense to you, leave a like. Not to please the algorithm, but to keep this type of narrative alive. Subscribe to the channel. We don't promise shortcuts. We don't promise any formulas. Only true stories, human decisions, and choices that continue to work when nobody is looking. Because when the cold returns, who gets prepared, there's no need to rush.